Hello, thank you all for listening. My name is Christopher Hernandez. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Loyola University Chicago. My pronouns are he, him, él. After a long summer of travel, I currently have a dark complexion with tan skin. My hair is short and black. My clothing is nothing special. I'm wearing khaki dress pants and a maroon polo shirt. My presentation is titled Unconquered Forest, Plants, Animals, and More Than Human Relationships in Colonial Era Maya Warfare. Today, I present initial threads of my research into the role played by plants, animals, and other forms of life in resisting Spanish colonization. In so doing, I aim to insert forests, landscapes, and the environment into discussions of military history as active, at times sentient agents. I demonstrate how more than human relationships not only paved the way for Spanish colonization, but also allowed for some groups, such as the Lacanton Maya, to remain unconquered. In today's talk, I'll begin by discussing the myths about the Spanish conquest and what is called the New Conquest history. I then discuss studies of ecological imperialism to highlight how my research contributes to and bridges historical and biological analyses of the colonization in the Americas. I do so by examining the role of more than human persons in countering colonization. I develop this argument by delving into knowledge and philosophy of the Mayas. This allows me to argue for the agentive human-like qualities of the forest, to think about the role of the forest and its life as a combatant. I conclude with final thoughts and future directions of this work. There are many myths surrounding the process of European colonization in the Western Hemisphere. Today, I focus mainly on the Spanish conquest of what they and other Europeans eventually named the Americas. One of the biggest conquest myths is so pervasive that it often goes unnoticed by members of the general public and professional scholars. The notion of Spanish conquest erases the diversity of actors who played a role in subduing the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica and elsewhere. Guns, germs, and steel supposedly allowed a small group of Spaniards to defeat massive empires. At least that is what the colonizers wanted us to think. Through the erasure of non-Spanish agents, a myth of Spanish technological, intellectual, biological, and perhaps even moral superiority is perpetuated in grade schools and university campuses across the globe. The New Conquest history has countered the Eurocentric view of the conquest era by highlighting the agency of native peoples in the process of colonization. Some groups assisted the colonizers, others resisted. Many likely wanted to go about their lives without getting caught up in the struggle. Spanish guns and steel played a far smaller role than the thousands of indigenous allies and the massive loss of life caused by European-introduced diseases. Researchers have also demonstrated that in addition to disease-causing microorganisms, other forms of life played a pivotal role in colonization. Several scholars have demonstrated that human, animal, and biological relationships in general need to be considered to understand how colonization unfolded in the Americas. Yes, disease played a massive role in weakening Mesoamerican resistance. However, other organisms also played an important role. As Crosby highlighted in the 1970s, what he called the Columbian Exchange was as much a biological process as it was a cultural one. This work on biological exchange highlights that researchers and colonial chroniclers have more readily acknowledged the role of microorganisms and non-human forms of life in the colonial process than they have the role of indigenous peoples. Building from the work of Crosby, Melville examines how plagues of sheep transform Mesoamerican landscapes. As she argues, the European success can in great part be ascribed to the fact they did not come alone to the New World, but brought with them animals and plants, weeds, seeds, and diseases, all of which contributed to ecological imperialism. In regions where indigenous communities were devastated by disease, land and its resources became more accessible to invasive species such as sheep. Melville demonstrates how in the Valle de Mezquital, located in the northern basin of Mexico, sheep entered a heavily depopulated region and encountered a bounty of grazing land that led to a population explosion. Their growth hit carrying capacity and crashed, which left behind a land of mesquite-dominated desert. She argues this process occurred throughout Mexico during the first few decades of the colonial period. Thus, many areas of Mexico that were once productive and bountiful under Mesoamerican stewardship were transformed into deserts by plagues of sheep released by the Spanish. This process of environmental transformation occurred in colonial contexts beyond Mesoamerica. Melville demonstrates how a similar plague of sheep created arid conditions in parts of Australia during the 1800s. More recent work on colonial North America has demonstrated how domesticated grazing animals in many ways directed the colonial process. Cattle and other domesticated animals that were on the move pushed European colonizers further west into indigenous lands. As the grazing animals encroached and trespassed onto indigenous territories, the animals triggered clashes between settlers and indigenous peoples. These types of conflict played out large and small across what will become the US. Macro and microorganisms were often the spearheads of colonization and paved the way for Spaniards and other Europeans. Once cleared of indigenous stewards and the rich flora they helped create, Spaniards and other Europeans encountered lands they considered empty and thus labeled as terra nullius. My work bridges the New Conquest history with studies of ecological imperialism to consider how indigenous and more than human relationships played a role in countering colonization. I am specifically interested in how both elements became part of the war-making process. Military historians and scholars of war have long acknowledged the role of weather, terrain, and ecology in determining plans for war and martial outcomes. After all, armed forces need to take into consideration locally available resources, weather appropriate attire, terrain, and overall environmental conditions to increase the odds of success in a campaign or engagement. However, Western military history rarely considers land and its life as agents and combatants in their own right. This has not been the case for the ancient Mayas and their descendants. For Maya groups past and present, people were not radically separated from the world in terms of nature-culture divides. I acknowledge the works of anthropologists and others on relational philosophy, but choose to focus my discussion on Maya knowledge and philosophical conceptions. For the Mayas, humans are partable or constituted through myriad relationships. Moreover, things that are considered objects in Western ontologies are treated by the Mayas as active, potentially animate entities that can also have human qualities. For example, as Alice Balsanelli highlights for the Lacandon Mayas of Chiapas, Mexico, the forest is a person. Plants and animals for the Lacandon are constituted of the same animating forces or vitalities as humans and deities. This vitality that permeates everything means there is no sharp divide between nature and culture, but a world of interactive and interanimating entities. Thus, prey, such as a tapir, are seen by the Lacandon Mayas as persons, not as a human person, but another type of person that still had a home, lived in a community with a similar structure to that of humans, and perceived themselves as a person. In this relational ontology composed of human and more than human agents, animals, plants, and the forest in general played a role in warfare. Through communication with deities and other vitalities of the cosmos, Mayas, past and present, could petition for favorable outcomes in war. Ethnographic accounts demonstrate how in times of war, such as the Guatemalan Civil War of the 20th century, Jacaltec Mayas would communicate with the vital forces that congeal as mountains. They would ask for the protection of their soldiers and broader community in the face of genocidal violence. Moving back in time to the early colonial period and a few centuries before this era, Mayas would travel to sacred places such as the island of Cozumel to give offerings and petition deities in times of war. In addition to seeking divine assistance, colonial era records clearly demonstrate that for the Mayas in general, war could also include non-human forms of life. Some of the clearest evidence of the Mayas engaging with forest life in warfare can be found in the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is a sacred text that contains the history of the Quiche Mayas from the origins of the cosmos up to their time as rulers of large parts of the Guatemalan highlands during the post-classic and early Spanish colonial period. The post-classic is the era of Mesoamerican culture history that occurs just prior to the arrival of the Spanish. Although the oldest written version of the Popol Vuh was created during the colonial era, it clearly contains elements of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican culture. For example, many of the places the Quiche claim to have subjugated in pre-Columbian times have been documented archaeologically and corroborated by other colonial era written records. Moreover, the epic journey of the hero twins into and out of the underworld, which frames much of the early narrative in the Popol Vuh, is also a core element of pre-Columbian Maya cultures. The same basic hero twin narrative can be found in Maya iconography that extends back over 2,000 years before the arrival of the Spanish. The Popol Vuh contains descriptions of many battles and military tactics, such as placing important settlements on mountaintops for protection. Of particular interest today are descriptions of stinging insects taking part in the war-making process. In preparation for an attack, the Quiche Mayas made a palisade around the peak of a sacred mountain called Hakavits. They then placed effigies of people armed with arrows and shields along the fortifications. According to the Popol Vuh, with these, they encircled the citadel. Then also they entreated Tohil, their patron deity, with their thoughts. What if we should die? What if we are defeated? They asked. Thus their hearts wept before the face of Tohil. Do not mourn, I am. You shall use these against them, do not fear. Thus he, Tohil, spoke to Balamkits, Balamakab, Mahukuta, and Ikui Balam, the Quiche leaders. And they were given the hornets and wasps. So they went out to gather them, and they returned bearing them. And these they placed inside 4 great gourds, which they positioned in 4 places around the edge of the citadel. The hornets and wasps were closed up within the great gourds. They, the Quiche, used these as weapons against the oncoming nations. Later on, we hear about the ensuing combat. Then the oncoming warriors ascended a little way up the face of the mountain, but it was only a little way, for they did not reach the entrance of the citadel. And then they opened the 4 gourds that were in the citadel, and out flew the hornets and the wasps. They were like clouds of smoke when they came out of each of the gourds. The warriors were thus finished off because of the insects. The text goes on to state that the swarm is so overpowering that the attackers become disoriented, easy targets for the defending Quiche men and women. The text from the Popol Vuh is clear that through divine intervention, the wasps and hornets became a critical aspect of the Quiche victory in Hakavits. Based on the text as a whole, and Maya ontologies more broadly, it would not be far-fetched to consider the stinging insects as persons. Earlier in the Popol Vuh, we learn about the hero twins interacting with bug persons, such as talking, sentient mosquitoes. We are also told about gourds with the qualities of a person, such as calabashes with faces indistinguishable from that of the hero twins. Here, a Western ontology might suggest a distinction between mythical time and historical time. The hero twin narrative takes place during the origins of the cosmos before humans and our current creation existed, whereas the events on Hakavits occurred within the span of human history, centuries prior to the arrival of the Spanish when the Quiche traversed the Mesoamerican highlands. Yet this distinction between myth and reality that relies on the notion of facts rooted in objectivity is not one that Maya peoples use to structure their histories. Other indigenous accounts of martial engagements between Spanish-led forces and the Mayas contain humans that transform into more than human beings with wings and wield weapons with divine power. For a well-known example, see the indigenous account of the defeat of Tekun Uman. This view of an active nature with human qualities informs my reading of colonial era documents and Maya martial practice. Written records from the Spanish perspective are filled with references to the forest ecology of the Maya highlands and lowlands. From their perspective, it was both a matter of obtaining new environmental knowledge and documenting potential resources for extraction. From a tactical perspective, Spanish chroniclers constantly complain about the heat, humidity, and teeming life of the forest. This Spanish and general European disdain for the rainforest environment, along with their limited knowledge of Mesoamerican landscapes, created a tactical advantage for indigenous peoples. They could flee deep into the forest where Europeans were unlikely to follow them. Even if the Spanish decided to chase after what they labeled as rebel or wild groups, the Mayas stood a good chance of remaining undetected. This was the case for the Itza and Chol-speaking Lacandon Mayas, who lived in the rainforest of Mexico and Guatemala. From their communities deep in the rainforest, they launched attacks against Spanish-controlled settlements and were able to elude colonization well into the 17th century. Even with the destruction of the last independent Maya kingdom in 1697, the rainforests of southern Mesoamerica remained a place where Maya could seek refuge from Spanish rule. In fact, the contemporary Yucatec-speaking Lacandon Maya utilized this zone of refuge by living in small, scattered homesteads. The dwellings were often thatched roof structures with no walls that allowed for quick escape. Their house lots could also be surrounded by stands of thorny plants. Living in this manner, the Lacandon were never conquered by the Spanish. The major sustained incursions into contemporary Lacandon territory really began under the auspices of the Mexican nation-state in the 19th century with the search for forest materials to feed international networks of industrial commercial production. A typical reading of this history that I just elaborated of resistance would likely treat the rainforest as a resource or object utilized by the Mayas to their tactical advantage, as well as a resource/object sought after by colonizers. For example, David Patel examines how dense forests have historically been battlegrounds for regular armies and strategic military assets. His work specifically focuses on the caste war of Mexico that occurred during the 1800s. Patel's work is an insightful and welcome contribution to environmental studies of Maya military history. Yet, his study stresses the agency of the Mayas and other people, but not the forest. In terms of relational philosophy, mainstream/Western scholarship is arriving at similar conclusions as the Mayas and other indigenous groups. Studies of landscape, materiality, actor networks, among others, are acknowledging the active dynamics of the non-human cosmos to consider the agency of land in its life. In other words, the division between the human and the non-human is becoming increasingly blurred. If people make war with land by fighting on and fortifying terrain that provides a martial advantage, such as mountaintops, then the same principle applies to the Maya tactical engagement with the forest. The Mayas who resisted Spanish colonial domination, such as the Lacandon or Itza, did so with the forest. The inability and/or unwillingness of Spanish officials to capture the Mayas who fled into and chose to live in the forest was as much a result of the active dynamics of the rainforest ecology as it was human design. The rainforest has its own defense mechanisms, such as stinging insects and poisonous plants, which were highly effective against Spanish-led colonizing forces. Just like the insect persons in the Popol Vuh, the Mayas worked with the environmental conditions of the rainforest to resist, and at least in one case, maintain a degree of indigenous autonomy and self-determination. As I mentioned at the start, these are initial thoughts on my project into the more than human aspects of war making. This work applies a relational approach that centers Mayan knowledge and philosophy to consider the role of more than human agents in anti-colonial struggle. Going forward, I aim to apply this conceptual frame to examine archaeological remains of fortifications. How did the choice of building materials affect Maya perceptions of structures and their war-making ability? Beyond objects for war, how did walls, people, land, and its life combine to create martial landscapes? Perhaps faunal assemblages and carbonized plant remains recovered through soil flotation are combatants whose role has gone unacknowledged. This work will continue to center Maya knowledge to examine the agency of the forest and break down Western conceptions of objects and subjects. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out my other videos.